The astonishing silence in Zaporizhzhia perhaps indicates that Ukraine is preparing to counterattack from here. So on what factors will Kiev's success or failure depend? What has Russia done in the past 6 months to face Ukraine's offensive campaigns, strongly supported by the US and the West? Meanwhile, at the White House, US officials are said to be quietly calculating the next move if Kiev's counterattack fails, something entirely possible. American authorities worry they will face a two-headed monster if Ukraine becomes bogged down and time will always be on the Russian side. How exactly? The countdown to the counterattack is ticking by hour, but there is still too much uncertainty. What scenarios could occur? Please join us and find out in today's World Affairs. Recently, CNN reporters say that they saw most of desolate plains in Zaporizhzhia, where there should be lights of armored vehicles. Sometimes tank trucks appeared in the mud but then disappeared into oblivion. Artillery drills echo from afar, which locals say happen regularly. Why is there such an eerie silence? The silence is beginning to be telling. Ukraine has made extraordinary efforts to conceal the start of a strategically vital counteroffensive, like with its fast and smart push around Izium and Kharkiv in the late summer last year. We may only learn of success when it has been conclusively achieved. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar stated last week that the counteroffensive would not be announced. Russia, for its part, is also reluctant to speak of Ukrainian momentum, perhaps in case that the shuttle flagging moral among its own troops. Just Sunday, April the 23rd, the US-based Institute for the Study of War reported comments by Russian military bloggers suggesting that Ukrainian forces has crossed the Dnipro River near Kherson in small numbers, but in places where Moscow would prefer to think they would not. It was unclear how sustained or unprecedented the apparent small Ukrainian landings were, or how they fitted into Ukraine's wider plan. Ukraine's Southern Command said little but opaquely called for patience. A spokesperson, Natalia Humaniuk, said the conditions of military operation required information silence until it is safe enough for our military. Over the past 10 days, Ukraine has been noticeably silent about whole Zaporizhzhia area, where its counter-offensive is largely expected. Only there can its military separate the occupied peninsula of Crimea from occupied territory in eastern Ukraine and the Russian mainland. There have been tiny comments on Russian legion of military bloggers who have been given the title Operation of Security deployed by Kiev, often the first source of information about Ukrainian maneuvers and the post-offensives. Kurpani, Mariupol, Kamiansk, and Polyhi, these are all places where pro-Russian bloggers have suggested Ukrainian attempts to move forward. The evidence for these claims is frustrating, unclear, and bloggers have a poor track record. Russian aviation is also trying to hit what it thinks are Ukrainian targets. The town of Orikhiv, about 40 miles southeast of Zaporizhzhia, has seen the repeated bombarding of anything that might resemble a military hub. A sports school, a farming warehouse, empty buildings now featuring a vast crater. The tiny settlement of Volodya on the further eastern end of where Ukraine might launch a counteroffensive in the south has been hit by several heavy airstrikes in the past 48 hours. The intense and indiscriminate Russian firepower suggests the high stakes of the weeks ahead. This is a fight that Moscow has known as coming for 6 months. The Russians have had ample time to prepare. Russian President Vladimir Putin himself even visited the theater of war last week and met with the head of the airborne forces, Mikhail Toplinskin, whose paratroopers will be at the forefront of any defense. They have a dark networks of widening trenches and defenses, which Ukrainian troops will likely either stumble on or just go around. Gains for Ukrainian forces in Zaporizhzhia, however, could strike a more potent blow to Russia's wider campaign. It is the land corridor from occupied Donbass to occupied Crimea, the piece of territory signed by Russia last year that is in the long term the most useful, linking the land a peninsula annexed in 2014 with the Russian mainland. Losing this would greatly imperil Russia's military in Crimea and split its occupation in two, which would also betray the strategic incompetence of its military. This is also a decisive moment for Kiev. NATO has been uncharacteristically united and bold in its support and arming of Ukraine. This source of clarity of purpose is an outlier in Western democracies and one that elections, economic variables, and other distractions may dilute in the year ahead. The Ukrainians face an enemy weaker than it has been for months, with the Russian even sending wounded convicts back to the fight on the front line, according to accounts from convict recruits. Kiev's forces have a better weaponry and training from NATO than ever before, and they surely have a good real-time information from their Western allies to pry open any advantage. And the silence that we see now may be the clearest indicator yet that this vital step is afoot.
CNN viết, sự im lặng đang bao trùm, không có video trên mạng xã hội, không có bình luận chính thức từ mặt trận Zaporizhzhia. Đó có thể là dấu hiệu rõ ràng nhất về một bước đi quan trọng giờ đã in hẳn trên mặt đất.
According to the Times, without a decisive victory, Western support for Ukraine could weaken and Kiev could come under increasing pressure to enter serious peace talks to end or freeze the conflict.
Đồng thời Kiev sẽ gánh chịu áp lực nặng nề hơn khi nghĩ về đối thoại hòa bình nghiêm túc để kết thúc hoặc đóng băng cuộc xung đột.
Ukraine is preparing to launch a counteroffensive against Russian forces as early as May, American officials say. American and NATO allies have supplied Ukraine with extensive artillery and ammunition for the upcoming battle. The officials now say they are hopeful the supplies will last, a change from 2 months ago when weapons were only trickling in, and U.S. officials were worried that the supplies might run out. Everything hinges on this counteroffensive, said Alexandra Visbol, a former U.S. ambassador to Russia and senior NATO official. Everyone's hopeful may be over-optimistic, but it will determine whether there is going to be a decent outcome for the Ukrainians in terms of recovering territory on the battlefield and creating much more significant leverage to get some kind of negotiated settlement. While Ukrainian officials have said the goal is to break through darkened Russian defenses and create a widespread collapse in Russia's army, American officials have assessed that it's unlikely the offensive will result in a dramatic shift in momentum in Ukraine's favor. Ukraine's military faces many challenges, one reason that a stalemate remains the most likely outcome. Fighting in Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine this winter has drained ammunition reserves and led to heavy casualties in some experienced units. And yet, American military officials say it is possible that Ukraine's army could once again surprise them. They are now armed with European tanks and American armored personnel carriers, and have new units trained and equipped by Americans and NATO forces. I am optimistic that between this year and next year, I think Ukraine will continue to have momentum with it. Britain's Defense Secretary Ben Wallace told reporters during a visit to Washington last week, I also think we should be realistic. There is not going to be a single magic wand moment when Russia collapses. If the United States and its allies can identify significant weaknesses in Russia's defenses, Ukraine can exploit them with the speed and protection of tanks and broadly fighting vehicles. Still, big gains are not guaranteed or even necessarily likely. The battlefield is heavily mined by the Russians, and the Ukrainian advance will depend on whether Kiev's forces can effectively deploy mine-clearing equipment, much of which the West has provided. Ukraine builds the new combat brigades by pairing raw recruits with a small call of experienced veteran soldiers. Beginning in January, the unit went to American training grounds in Germany to learn how to use the new equipment and how to conduct what the American Army calls combined arms maneuvers, using effective communication to coordinate advancing troops with supporting units such as tanks and artillery. Training on this tactic has gone well according to multiple U.S. officials, and a motivated Ukrainian force has shown itself to be a quick study. But employing new tactics is often easier in training exercises than it is on the battlefield, especially with the Russians so darkened. Soldiers fighting in Ukraine have said that so far sophisticated maneuver warfare has been all but impossible to execute. They have struggled to coordinate their operations because they require strong communications, which is difficult because radio equipment differs from unit to unit and is susceptible to Russian jamming. One soldier in Ukraine who participated in a recent field attack in southern Ukraine said that coordinating anything above the platoon level, a unit of about 30 soldiers, remains extremely difficult. If the Ukrainians succeed in using these new tactics, even to a small degree, they may be able to overcome the numerically superior Russian forces. Major questions about Ukraine's artillery and other ammunition supplies remain. Kiev's supplies of air defense missiles and artillery round, critical to sustaining an post and to defend against Russian air attacks, could run dangerously low if its force continue to expand ammunition at their current pace. After the offensive is over, there is a little chance that the West can recreate the build-up that it did for Ukraine's coming assault for the foreseeable future, because Western allies do not have enough supplies in existing inventory to draw from, and domestic production will not be able to fill the gap until next year, experts say. While Ukrainian forces can use drones to strike behind Russia's front lines, they have not been given missiles with long enough range to hit Russian logistical hubs, a tactic that proved important in last summer's offensives outside Kyiv and Kherson. The Russians have challenges of their own. The Russians have expanded many of their cruise missiles, lost thousands of people in Bakhmut alone, and drained their stores of ammunition much faster than they can replace them with their domestic production. But Russia is working to address those gaps. Russian troops have honed their ability to use drones and artillery to target Ukrainian forces more effectively. They have recently started using glide bombs, which use gravity and basic guidance devices to reach their targets without making any noise, to show they are still capable of deploying new weapons on the battlefield. The effort means the window to make significant gains against Russia's depleted forces may not remain open indefinitely. In private meetings, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has told other officials that he believes Russia has the numerical advantages on the battlefield because it has more planes, tanks, artillery pieces, and soldiers than the Ukrainians. American intelligence officials have repeatedly warned that President Vladimir Putin of Russia thinks this time is on his side. Given Russia's bigger reserves on equipment and manpower, the officials say Mr. Putin believes he will ultimately emerge victorious as the West's appetite to support Ukraine subsides. U.S. and European officials say Russia is preparing new rounds of mobilizations to bolster the ranks of its military without creating the same exodus of young men from country, which occurred last year when a partial mobilization was announced. A key focus of the United States and the West has been trying to stop Russia from finding new supplies of weaponry. U.S. and NATO officials have heightened Russia's domestic manufacturing with sanctions and export controls, but put diplomatic pressure on countries to reject Russian requests for arms. China appeared to have been deterred, at least for the moment, from providing ammunition or other lethal aid to Russia. Another apparent success has been Egypt, while U.S. officials were quietly pressing Cairo to supply artillery shells to Ukraine. U.S. intelligence agency gathered information, first reported by the Washington Post, that Egyptian officials might also supply weaponry to Russia. After a diplomatic push by the United States and Britain, the Egyptians appeared to side with Americans. U.S. officials said a production contract has been agreed with Egyptian state-owned arms makers to produce artillery cells for the United States and American contractors, who in turn will send them to Ukraine. In the meantime, the Biden administration is quietly preparing for the possibility that Ukraine's spring counteroffensive falls short of expectation. Publicly, President Joe Biden's team has offered unwavering support for Ukraine, pledging to load it up with weapons and economic aids for as long as it takes. But if the impending fighting season yields limited gains, administration officials have expressed privately they fear being faced with a two-headed monster attacking it from the hawkish and dovish ends of the spectrum. One side would say that Ukraine's advances would have worked had the administration given Kiev everything it's asked for, namely longer-range missiles, fighter jets, and more air defenses. The other side, administration officials worry when claim Ukraine's shortcoming proves it can't force Russia out of its territory completely. According to Political, there has been discussion, perhaps, of framing it to the Ukrainian as a ceasefire, not as a permanent peace talks, leaving the door open for Ukraine to regain more of its territory at a future date. Incentive would have to be given to Kiev, perhaps NATO-like security guarantee, economic help from European Union, more military aid to replenish and bolster Ukraine's forces, and the like. And ads have expressed hope of re-engaging China to push Putin to the negotiating table as well. U.S. allies in Europe are increasingly pushing for Ukraine and Russia to sit down at the negotiating table. According to them, it is a less painful option than the prolonged stalemate on the battlefield. European public support may wane over time as European energy and economic costs stay high, said Clementine Starling, a director and fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank in Washington, D.C. A fracturing of transatlantic support will likely hurt U.S. domestic support, and Congress and the Biden administration may struggle to sustain it. Biden and his top aides have publicly stressed that Zelensky should only begin peace talks when he's ready. But Washington has also communicated to Kiev some political realities. At some point, especially with the Republicans in control of the House of Representatives, the pace of U.S. aids will likely slow. Officials in Washington, though not pressing Kiev, has begun preparing for what those conversations could look like and understand it may be a tough political sell at home for Zelensky. If the Ukraine can't gain dramatically on the battlefield, the question inevitably arises as to whether it is a time for a negotiated stop to the fighting, says Richard Hart, president of the Council on the Foreign Relations. It is expensive. We are running low on munitions. We have got other contingencies around the world to prepare for. U.S. officials have also briefed Ukraine on the dangers of overstanding its ambitions and spreading a trip too thin, the same warning Biden gave the Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani as the Taliban moved to swap across the country during the U.S. military withdrawal in 2021. But the chances of Ukraine backing down from its highest aspirations is, to say the least, unlikely. It's as if this is the only and last opportunity for Ukraine to show that it can win, which of course isn't true, said Alina Polyakova, president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. Kiev's counterattack is still full of mysteries and will only be revealed in the coming time. With that, we conclude today's program. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.